People have been smeared, threatened, deplatformed, arrested, sacked, that opposing an Israeli onslaught defined by the mass murder of Palestinian men, women and children, by the maiming of countless people, by starvation, by torture, by rape, by the apocalyptic levels of destruction, the mass murder of aid workers, medics, journalists. Those who have cheered on one of the worst crimes of our age suffer no consequences, quite the opposite. They remain treated as mainstream, as respectable. As I've often said from the beginning of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people, the world is turned on its head. This brings me to the case of Dan Hodges, a newspaper columnist for the Mail on Sunday. Now, it is tempting to simply dismiss this man as a glorified internet troll who, like many of the Nepo babies who populate the incestuous cesspit that is, I'm afraid, the British media, may not have intelligence or insight, but did have a famous mother. Many of those who cheered on Israel's genocidal onslaught have simply gone quiet as the scale of depravity became simply too obscene for them to unapologetically defend. They walked away from the crime scene, hands in their pockets, whistling, hoping nobody would notice. Dan Hodges' own interventions on this subject are now few and far between. His latest contribution, if we can call it that, came in response to Israel's Twitter account. It has an official Twitter account, which is often just full of disgusting bile, frankly. But in this case, they posted about Israeli hostages who were released this weekend. Now, to be clear, as I have been from the start, taking civilians hostages is a war crime for which there is no justification. They should always have been released. Israel's official account shared before and after pictures showing how much weight these hostages have lost. Now, as the Israeli journalist Imi Reader put it, first and foremost, taking civilian hostages is a war crime and Hamas is entirely responsible for every hostage's physical and mental state. But dear fellow Israelis and their cheerleaders, what did you think would happen to the hostages when you decided to starve Gaza? At the very beginning, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced there would be a total siege in Gaza, blocking the essentials of life. Last April, 2 US government agencies concluded that Israel was deliberately blocking aid from getting to the people of Gaza. Last October, the United Nations reported that more than 1.8 million Palestinians were suffering extremely critical levels of hunger, with 70% of crop fields destroyed. There's been multiple cases of Palestinian children who have died because of starvation-related complications. As Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, put it last April, the Israeli government's use of starvation as a weapon of war has proven deadly for children in Gaza. There wasn't even the tiniest fraction of outrage over Israel's deliberate starvation of an entire people in which little kids starve to death, as there has been about these Israeli hostages. Now, it should also be noted that the conditions of Palestinians in captivity are overall much, much worse. Thousands of Palestinians are detained without charge and without trial, while others are subjected to kangaroo military courts where the judge is an Israeli soldier. The trial lasts minutes. It's conducted in Hebrew with a 99% conviction rate. Israel is the only country on earth to routinely try children in military courts. As Save the Children reported before the 7th of October, child detainees are subjected to physical and sexual abuse. There are at the moment, over 200 Palestinian children in detention. Other detainees have included an 82-year-old woman with dementia. There are multiple examples of sexual abuse and rape, including of both Palestinian men and women. One Palestinian detainee was even gang raped on camera. Now, one of Gaza's most prominent doctors was reportedly raped to death, with 3 Israeli guards taking it in turns to rape him with their M16 rifles. 54 Palestinian detainees have died in Israeli prisons, many of them clearly tortured to death. Israeli human rights organisation B'Tselem have revealed the systemic policy of abusing and torturing thousands of Palestinians in its custody, detailing harsh, arbitrary violence on a frequent basis, sexual assault, humiliation and degradation, deliberate starvation, forced lack of hygiene, sleep deprivation, restriction and punishment of religious worship, confiscation of all group and personal belongings, and the denial of adequate medical care. Meanwhile, Palestinian detainees have repeatedly been released appearing emaciated and clearly ill-treated. There's no outrage about any of this. Why? Because Palestinians are not treated as though they're human beings. It's very straightforward. Very simply, Israelis are seen as us, Westerners. Palestinians are treated as them, with any amount of depravity inflicted on them not only tolerated, but enthusiastically embraced. Now, Dan Hodges tweeted in response to Israel's tweets about the hostages, I do not want to see a single penny of British taxpayers' money spent on the reconstruction of Gaza until every Hamas terrorist is either dead or in jail. I don't care about the broader politics. When journalist Matthew Stadlen responded, in the meantime, the civilian population, including hundreds of thousands of children, can just go to hell, right? And Dan Hodges responded bluntly, yes, basically. Another told him being pro-genocide is not a good look, Dan, and he responded, I'll wear it lightly. While another user tweeted, I feel sorry for the ordinary Palestinians. They've been cynically used by Hamas/Iran. He said, I've got to be honest, my sympathy for ordinary Palestinians is pretty low this morning. When he was asked about other Arab states paying for the reconstruction, he responded, they shouldn't pay for it either until Hamas had been completely destroyed. Let's just digest for a moment what this national newspaper journalist, who appears on mainstream TV and radio, is saying. He was specifically told that his statement meant that the entire civilian population can just go to hell, and he said yes, basically. And he specifically asked about ordinary Palestinians. He didn't just say he had pretty low sympathy for ordinary Palestinians. He put ordinary Palestinians in inverted quotes, in scare quotes, which I would interpret as him disputing there is such a thing as an innocent Palestinian civilian. He is inferring both collective guilt and collective punishment. When he says that Gaza should be deprived of any financial support from anyone, including Arab states, until Hamas is destroyed, he says that means every Hamas terrorist is either dead or in jail. What he describes there is literally an impossible goal. As the former Secretary of State Antony Blinken put it just before the end of Joe Biden's tenure as president, we assess that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost. That was after 15 months of one of the most sophisticated advanced militaries on Earth, armed to the teeth by the world's only superpower, reducing Gaza, a tiny strip of land, to apocalyptic rubble, with Israel's military intelligence service, Shin Bet, concluding a year ago that Hamas would survive in some form after Israel's onslaught. It turns out you cannot defeat an idea, and if you slaughter huge numbers of innocent people, then some of their loved ones, their parents, their children, their lovers, their friends, are going to fight you to the bitter end. Indeed, someone pointed this out to him. They tweeted, Hamas will always be there. The young ones will take up arms to replace the ones who have perished. Israel's deadly actions will always have resistance. Sadly, there will never be peace in the region. He responded, fine, then leave it in rubble. Now, in any case, by the way, Israel repeatedly lies about who Hamas is. As Israeli soldiers told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the Israeli military murders civilians and then claims their victims are quote-unquote Hamas terrorists, which they know isn't true, meaning the official tally of Hamas terrorists killed is itself a lie. They provided one example when an IDF spokesperson announced their forces had killed over 200 militants. In practice, of those 200 fatalities, only 10 were confirmed as known Hamas operatives. What Dan Hodges is supporting in practice would mean almost everyone in Gaza dying. As just one example, 83% of Gaza's plant life has been destroyed. The healthcare system, the hospitals, are in ruins. As Donald Trump himself has publicly conceded, albeit to justify ethnic cleansing, Gaza is just not a place that can sustain life as is. Hodges supports Israel waging a never-ending war because if you wage a remorseless war on an entire people, there will always be an endless supply of new recruits wanting to fight back, and Israel will always falsely claim that the people they are killing are Hamas. Indeed, Hodges makes clear his anti-Palestinian racism. He is self-evidently an anti-Palestinian racist. He isn't trying to hide it. Let's just be clear. This is what he says means. When asked yesterday if he still stood by responding to a tweet which said, in the meantime, the civilian population, including hundreds of thousands of children, can just go to hell, right? He said, in response, yes, basically. Going to hell means dying. It means babies dying. It means children dying. Half of Gaza's population are children. It means pregnant women dying. It means elderly men and elderly women dying. He openly embraces collective punishment. Indeed, when someone tweets, that's collective punishment, he responds, fine. Collective punishment is a grave war crime. Now, he's not an intelligent guy, let's be clear, but he will know that he's there supporting a war crime. Just imagine on the 7th of October, a commentator tweeted they had pretty low sympathy for Israel's population. Just imagine they agreed that Israel's civilian population, including hundreds of thousands of children, should go to hell. Imagine they agreed with collective punishment against Israeli civilians. That person would immediately lose their job. Their feet wouldn't touch the ground. And if they continued to tweet all of what Dan Hodges has tweeted about Israelis, they would likely be arrested. I spoke to a British lawyer about this. He said that Dan Hodges' statement is dangerously close to, if it has not already violated UK law, including the Public Order Act, which criminalises stirring up racial hatred. They add, even more concerningly, inciting or endorsing actions that could contribute to genocide or crimes against humanity may itself violate UK law, including provisions under the International Criminal Court Act 2001. But here and now, there are no consequences for Dan Hodges' career. Almost no British mainstream journalist has even criticised Hodges. I just want to add some further context. Dan Hodges was one of those who spread the lie that Israeli babies had been beheaded on the 7th of October. This is important. So let me just go through what he tweeted at the time, because accountability is very important here. He quote tweeted Rob Burley, formerly the producer of BBC Live programming, who said, "Reports of 40 babies, some beheaded, found at a kibbutz. This isn't freedom fighting, it's depraved violence perpetrated by sick men." Someone challenged him, "Is this a fact? I'm sure you would not post this without verification. For shame if you did." Burley then posted a clip from Israeli television as proof. Astonishingly, he has never deleted this misinformation. Hodges then added his own comment to this disgusting lie. He said, "People have said Israel's response must be proportionate. Fine. What's a proportionate response to this? What would our proportionate response be if terrorists did that here?" When told the response shouldn't be massacring Palestinian babies and children who are not responsible for Hamas's murderous crime, he said, "I didn't ask that. I asked what a proportionate response should be to the massacre of babies. Can you tell me?" When asked if people would have been happy for the RAF, the Royal Air Force, to bomb nationalist communities in Northern Ireland when the IRA were happily slaughtering British troops and civilians on mainland UK, he said if they'd walked into a maternity ward and beheaded 40 babies, yes. Notably, people responded to him, challenging him on whether these reports had been confirmed yet. That is private citizens challenging a journalist at a national newspaper on the most basic principles of journalism. No Israeli babies were beheaded on the 7th of October. Not one. The number of Israeli infants killed on the 7th of October is one. 8-month-old Mila Cohen. She was shot dead through the door of a safe room by Hamas militants. Indisputably a crime, no question, along with the other war crimes committed that day. The purpose of the false claim about the beheading of Israeli babies, which was spread by multiple British newspapers and the President of the United States, was very straightforward. There was almost nothing you can think of which is more depraved than beheading babies. The intention was to present violence committed by Palestinian militants as uniquely depraved and thus distinct from the violence of the Israeli state. And you can see from Hodges' tweets why it was to build acquiescence and consent for Israel's mass slaughter of the Palestinian people. That was the point of this claim. As soon as people felt horrified or traumatized by the butchery of Palestinian civilians, Israel's cheerleaders could go, "Remember the beheaded Israeli babies. Dull your senses of empathy, of revulsion, because Gaza is inhabited by monsters." While one Israeli infant was killed on the 7th of October, by the 1st of January this year, 1,091 Palestinian infants had been reported violently killed out of at least 17,400 children, compared to the 36 Israeli children killed on the 7th of October. By infants, we're talking about those aged under the age of 1. Of those infants, 238 were babies born after the 7th of October. These are likely to be considerable underestimates, excluding those, for example, who died because of a lack of medical care because Israel destroyed Gaza's hospitals. These were babies who were burned alive by Israeli weapons. These were babies whose tiny, fragile little bodies, with their little fingers and their little toes and their delicate skulls, were ripped apart. Others were crushed to death and suffocated under rubble. Others were beheaded by Israeli weapons. Others were starved to death. Some died instantly, some did not. They died in pain. Born into a world of horror, dying unimaginably cruel deaths. The likes of Dan Hodges expressed infinitely more horror over fictional killings of Israeli babies than they have over the mass slaughter of Palestinian babies. And note how Hodges has never deleted his false claim. I see no apology for his false claims anywhere. What possible justification could there be for that? If I said that Israeli soldiers were going around beheading Palestinian babies, leaving aside the Palestinian babies who'd been beheaded because of Israeli weapons, for example, exploding, if I said Israeli soldiers were using knives to behead Palestinian babies and that was shown to be false, what do you think would happen? What do you think the consequences of that will be? What would happen even in the context of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian babies actually being slaughtered in vast numbers by Israeli weapons? Again, likely to be career-ending. I'd be torn apart. I would be regarded as a disgrace to journalism. But Hodges can get away with spreading false claims about 7th October with no consequences. And as we can see, he uses those false claims to try and build support for an onslaught which then actually caused the mass slaughter of babies, as well as so many other innocent civilians. Dan Hodges offers up an instructive case study about the British media. Hodges can openly support war crimes. He can openly support the mass slaughter of civilians. He can openly make clear his racist contempt for an entire ethnic group, and he suffers no consequences. Well, that simply cannot be allowed to happen. We cannot normalise this depravity. Normalising this sort of depravity will have devastating consequences, not just for Palestinians, but for all humanity. If we simply normalise murderous racism, which is what this is, we will go to ever darker places. All of the worst crimes of our history were made possible by the sort of attitudes shamelessly expressed by Dan Hodges. That is, obscene levels of dehumanization, which are used to justify barbarism. In the here and now, he will not suffer consequences. But we must not give up until people like Hodges do face consequences, by which I mean his tawdry little career ended in disgrace and him being turned into a public pariah like other apologists for other terrible atrocities. Either Israel's genocide is remembered for what it is, a terrible crime, when it is normalized as humanity plunges into a hellish abyss of violent barbarism. And it might take years and years until we get accountability, but we can never, ever, ever, ever give up fighting for accountability. We must keep the receipts. We must remember what people did and said when there was no excuses, when it was perfectly clear what Israel had done to the people of Gaza. The stakes are too high. Right now, the likes of Hodges feels impunity, which is why he uses his platform to so shamelessly and unapologetically issue such depraved statements. That impunity must end because the stakes are simply too high. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. Help us as we expand our operations, as you can see, across TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, X, and the rest at patreon.com/owned84. Share the video, get the message out. I'll speak to you soon.